Hello and welcome to AeroTime interviews as part of our Women in Aviation campaign. My name's Hunter McLeod. I'm a pilot in Australia and recently shared my COVID story on AeroTime. I'm now delighted to be back on AeroTime today, but this time I get to interview an inspirational pilot who literally did change the world for female aviators here in Australia and no doubt around the world too. I would love to introduce you to Captain Deborah Lawrie, who is today a check and training captain. She obtained a private pilot license in 1971 at just 18 years old, and then her commercial pilot license in 1973. She logged 2,600 flying hours and became a general aviation flying instructor and charter pilot in 1976. After this, Captain Lawrie was the first woman to become a pilot with a major Australian airline after winning a landmark discrimination case against Ansett Airlines in the late 1970s. She went on to fly a range of aircraft in her long career, including the DC-9, 737, Fokkers, A330s, and many others. Lawrie was made a member of the Order of Australia in the 2019 Queen's Birthday Honours in recognition of her significant service to aviation as a commercial pilot and women in the profession. In June 2020, she was introduced into the Australian Aviation Hall of Fame. Debbie, I am just so honoured to be talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I have been really looking forward to this. I know a fair bit about your inspirational story, but I'm very glad we get to share this with the rest of the world here on AeroTime today.
Thanks, Hunter, and it's a real great pleasure to talk to you too.
Well, lovely. This is going to be just a love fest, I can tell already.
Yeah,
right.
It's a mutual admiration thing.
Shall we get into it?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's start the story. Now, I want to go back to the 1970s when you decided you were going to start learning to fly. What was the original motivator for you that got the ball rolling?
Well, it was actually a little bit earlier than that. It was in the late 60s, and my father had a midlife crisis, and he decided he was going to learn to fly for a hobby. And I was the eldest child and very close to my father. So I learnt the stuff with him, learned all the theory, helped him with checklists, learning those. Went to Moorabbin Airport with him, watched him go off and have his lesson. And I was only 14 at that time, and he promised me 2 lessons for my 16th birthday. So when I turned 16, I had my first lesson. I hated it. And the reason for that was because I was quite an awkward 16-year-old and I had a dress on, and I never flew with a dress on again. Because that created a big problem with the seat adjustment bar, which is between your legs on the Cherokee. I had my second lesson. I felt a little bit better, but because I was then paying for these lessons myself, it was quite some time between lessons. So I could only afford one a month because I was still in school. So I was doing all kinds of odd jobs to pay for these things. And my intention was just to go solo and prove to him that I could do it. That happened 11 months later, after 11 hours of flying lessons. And I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't, because I got the bug then. After going solo, I never looked back.
What was the cost of a lesson back in the 60s?
That's a really good question, and I actually know the answer. Dual was $13.50 and solo, yeah, I know, and solo was $8.50 an hour. So I know you're going to, I know, it's incredible.
So for anyone thinking about it now, the cost of a dual lesson can be anywhere from $300 to $400 an hour. So
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. All right, so we've got the ball rolling. You've started to do the hours. You've built up. You've got the license, and then you have to go and look for the first job. So most pilots have quite a dramatic story as to how they got their first flying position. Do you want to talk me through yours?
Well, my first flying job wasn't all that dramatic, really, because I was at the flying where I was learning to fly myself, or had learnt to fly. I was doing part-time work on the weekends, taking the bookings and keeping the logbooks and things like that. And doing that, I also got a discount off my lessons. So those prices I quoted to you might be discount prices, actually, just now that I'm recollecting. But anyway, as a part of that, once I got my commercial license and then went and did my instructor's rating on top of that, I moved into that flying school and became an instructor there. So for me, the transition to that first job wasn't all that difficult. I think the most challenging thing was getting enough hours to get the commercial license and then progress further on to the instructor's rating. And with getting the hours up for the commercial license, and this is where I could relate so much to what you're doing now, with you flying people into the outback. I was at university and I just thought it was a good idea in the holidays to say to a few friends, do you guys want to go on a safari around Australia? All you have to do is just chip in for the fuel and off we go. And I did a couple of those and they were amazing, really amazing trips. And these trusting souls who came along with me at the end of the trip learned how to refuel the aircraft. They learned how to tie it down. They learned how to navigate. It was really an amazing time. And all the places that I went to are very different now. For example, we could land on an airstrip beside Ayers Rock, right beside Ayers Rock, which you can't do today, but a lot of fun. So
you used to be able to taxi up to the pub, I think, and just park the aeroplane out the front of the pub. Was that the standard operating procedure for the Outback?
That was in Birdsville, yes. You could do that. And I used to bring opals back for a friend of my father's, and we would go to this place that was north of Quilpie in Queensland, where they actually made a strip for the aircraft. They bulldozed a strip. And when to do the shopping, we would jump in the aircraft and fly down to Quilpie and do the shopping and take it back up there. So it was a really different, it's really different.
It is. Australia is very vast. For the people that have never been to Australia, it is hours of flight time between a couple of towns. There's a lot of nothing. Yeah. All right. So you've done your stint in general aviation and then you started applying for the next big step, the airline job. First applied in 1976, but it wasn't until 1978 you were even given the opportunity to interview for the Australian airline Ansett. You were rejected. During those 2 years, you would have seen countless male pilots jump over you and into these positions. And after a knockback by Reg Ansett himself, what was the tipping point to say enough is enough to make you file that landmark legal case with the Victorian Equal Opportunity Board?
Well, it was a little bit different. The process was slightly different. I had put in my application to both airlines, which in those days were Ansett and TAA. I didn't go for Qantas at that point in time. I think because I didn't want to really do international. But I got replies back to my letters backwards and forwards, and finally Ansett did interview me, just checked my credentials, my license, logbook and all that sort of stuff. And then I was summoned for a second interview, which was a longer process with six training senior captains in the company. And then I was sent off for a psychological test and then a medical and all those things. So it was looking like I was going on track for a positive result. And I was interviewing with 28 other candidates, and I knew that I was pretty competitive with those guys. And then I got this letter to say that my application had been rejected and good luck with the rest of your career. That was the point where I said, well, that's not right. That can't be right, because I know that I've ticked all these boxes. So the equal opportunity law had just been introduced into Victoria, and my fiance at the time suggested that we go and see or make an appointment with the Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, which we did. So went along there, and told her what I thought had happened. And she, of course, when you're saying to somebody, you know, I should have been selected, they're going, well, what do you base that on? It's a very difficult question, sorry, to answer. However, she made a phone call herself to Reg Ansett, who was in charge of, owned the airline. And the response that she got left her in no doubt there had been some foul play there, or discrimination, if you like. And so she got right behind me and said, I think you've got a case here that you could challenge, you know. And what had actually happened was that I had been selected initially by that interview panel. But when they announced this to Big Boss, he said no. So it became a bit of a personal battle between him and myself, he and I.
So some of the excuses they gave you, or some of the excuses you heard later as to why they wouldn't hire women, was that you weren't physically strong enough, or that your menstrual cycle might come into effect, all sorts of horrible things that I read. Now, I, even in 2017, was told by an operator, we don't hire women, so don't even bother. I don't want to see your resume, I don't care. I cowered and I just went somewhere else. So how on earth did you find the strength back then to fight and keep fighting?
Well, first of all, I find it incredible that someone in 2017 would say that to a female pilot, because I think we've long since proved ourselves in the industry. So I'm kind of gobsmacked with that one. How did I keep going? Well, I'm very stubborn, always have been, and I don't take no for an answer, especially if I think I'm right. So, and I had nothing to lose. There was no harm in, you know, I wasn't going to be doing any harm by keeping on going. I didn't. The only thing that I did worry about in the end was maybe it would affect the job that I did have in as a flying instructor at the time. But I think the more horrible they got, and the more ridiculous arguments that they put forward, the more determined I became as well. So I had my moments, of course. I was interviewed many times by the television and newspapers and things along the way. And oftentimes I had to take a breather and do a hissy fit on the side and rant and rave and stamp my feet and get my composure back before I could answer questions. But so it was tough, but I wasn't going to give up.
I listened to your ABC interview, and I was actually just in the car randomly driving and you popped up, and I had to pull over and keep listening because I was just mesmerized. And the part that really grabbed me was you explaining the actual day of you walking into the courtroom. Would you mind retelling that?
Oh, the High Court, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the case had been held in front of the Equal Opportunity Board to start with, which was a Victorian legislation. And the board actually found that Ansett had discriminated, and they made 4 orders, one of which was that I was to be employed on the next pilot intake. Now, they decided they would appeal this. So they went to the Supreme Court a couple of times and they lost the appeals on each occasion. So finally, they were going to the High Court. So this is the highest court in the land in Australia, and that decision would be final. So it was a really big deal, and it was the High Court at that time was in Sydney. So I went up there because I was in Melbourne. My barrister, we spoke the night before, and in the meantime, to explain it to everybody, in the High Court, there were so many other legal representatives who were looking after each particular state law, equal opportunity law. So there were silks from South Australia, from Tasmania, from all the other places in Australia that had equal opportunity laws, and including Victoria. Ansett had about 10 lawyers and QCs, a mixture of, and all that sort of stuff. And I went into the court on my own, and I'm sitting there kind of interested what's going to happen here, with a full bench of 6 High Court judges, and my barrister wasn't there. He just wasn't there. And 1 minute went by, so on and so on. And finally, 10 minutes later, he comes bursting in the in the door, with the robe flying everywhere and the wig half on, and he sort of does this big whirlwind entry and sits down, and it all started. So it was a surreal situation. I was initially, I thought, why isn't he here? Why isn't he here? But of course, he had a perfect excuse. He just got caught up in the traffic. So.
You call it stubbornness. I think you are the strongest woman I've ever spoken to in my entire life. You are so impressive. So you win the case. The airline does hire you. Plans start moving forward. You get a ground school date. You do your ground school, but it seemed like the plan was never to actually put you on the line as a working pilot. So what was happening there, and how did Aussie media tycoon Rupert Murdoch intervene on that?
Right. Well, when those orders from the Equal Opportunity Board were still valid until the High Court had made their decision, there was quite a gap in between, or a lengthy time interval, where Ansett had stopped employing pilots because they didn't want to employ me, until the High Court decision was made, and then they would say, rightio, we've won it, no problem anymore. But it got to the point where they had to have an intake because they were so desperately short. So I was on that intake and went through the ground school, as you said, and did all those things in preparation to go and fly the aircraft. But they had no intention of that ever happening, because they wanted to string it out until they thought they would be winning the High Court case. In the meantime, Ansett himself had been so engrossed in this battle with me that he'd taken his eye off the ball of several other things associated with his business, and there were takeover bids happening all over the place. And eventually, Rupert Murdoch and Peter Abels took over the airline in the December, which was the time I had just finished my ground school. And so Ansett was no longer in charge of this airline. So I'm in ground school, but they're not going to let me fly the aircraft. The airline's been taken over by Abels and Murdoch, and Ansett is essentially doesn't have any power anymore. But the High Court case is still pending. The decision hasn't come down. So it was like a very strange time. But what Ansett didn't know was that I had taught Rupert Murdoch's brother-in-law how to fly. So, yeah.
Yes, Tommy, yes.
Yeah. And he's a lovely man, and I actually flew him to many places in Australia. And I don't often, call on people to help me, but I called him up and I said to him, John, I know they're keeping me out from, they're not allowing me to go on the aircraft or in the aircraft. So just letting you know. And he said, leave it with me. He was actually having a barbecue with Rupert Murdoch at the time. And to his credit, Rupert Murdoch then issued a message the following week, a couple of days later, and said that I was to be treated exactly like everybody else.
Oh, so, I just got tingles.
Yeah. And it was bizarre because they'd stalled 3 of us. So the others had gone through and started their aircraft training, but they kept 3 of us behind because I was going to be dropped and the other 2 would be paired. So now they had 3 of us and 1 was going to be without a partner, and they put me with one of the guys and put the other guy on his own because they couldn't, if for instance I had have stuffed it up and not reached the right standard, they really needed to cover their tracks by having witnesses and things like that. So, or not be seen to be making it more difficult for me, for instance.
Yeah. Wow.
That was a great time. I had a great time on that endorsement. It was seriously just amazing time. Amazing time.
I bet that every day would have felt like a win. Just walking in there would have just
yeah, and the lovely part about it was we had to go down to Launceston, so we flew from Melbourne to Lawrie, and on the Ansett aeroplane, and I was sitting there. I was like really nervous apprehensive about everything, and who turned out to be one of my dearest friends came. She's the purser on the flight. She came and leant on the back of the seat in front of the row in front. And she said, I'm Margaret, and I'm just here to tell you that all us girls are right behind you. And and I just, oh wow. So that was such a wonderful thing to have, to know that the girls were supporting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you flew your first flight on a Fokker Friendship from Alice Springs to Darwin, 22nd of December 1980. The first day online for anyone going from general aviation to airlines is terrifying. You had a little extra pressure though, and I'm sure everyone was watching and seeing how you were going to perform. How was the captain that you flew with that day? Do you remember bits and pieces?
Oh, I remember everything. He's also been a friend of mine ever since. He was an amazing guy. He said he would not fly with me if their intention was to fail me. He would only fly with me as long as I was going to be treated fairly. So that was, he was terrific. But I had to do a kind of a press conference thing before I left Melbourne. So I know, and I had to, because I passengered up on the 727 from Melbourne to Alice, and so I had to walk out on the tarmac, several times while they did the videoing and all this kind of stuff, and wave, all that stuff. And all I was looking forward to was just getting up to Alice Springs, meeting the training captain, getting on our way, and flying from there further north to Tennant Creek and so on. And again, when I arrived in Alice Springs, they said, oh, look, just one more photo, they've heard you're coming, and could you please, would you mind, okay. Because I was like really nervous. I wanted to just get in and do the stuff that, do. And I just thought, but I can't be rude or anything like that. So I thought, yes, I'll do one more photo. Could you lean up against the strut of the airplane? And I went, wheel strut. Wait, yep, sure. So I put my arm on the strut of the Fokker, and when I took it away, I had oil from here to here. Oh, and I was just like, oh, shit, but my training captain was so good. He just grinned, he said, no problem. He used to call me Deborah Jane. He'd say, no problem, Deborah Jane, just wipe it away.
Aww.
So yeah, he was gorgeous. Yeah.
What a sweetie.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other notable points in your career and aviation in Australia was the pilot strike back in 1989. Now, 1,640 pilots resigned, and our legendary Prime Minister at the time, Bob Hawke, declared a national emergency, allowing the Royal Australian Air Force to provide domestic air service in place of the airlines while they sorted it out. It was a huge deal, and people in Australia still talk about it and still refer to the scabs at the time. So tell us about your part in all of this and why you and your colleagues resigned.
Okay. that's a whole interview in itself, really. But to summarise it, there'd been a wage freeze for about 7 years, and the pilots were trying to catch up on the wages. And deregulation was just about on the doorstep in our country with the airline industry. So there was a lot of issues going on at the time, and Bob Hawke sided with the airline management to break the pilots' union. That was the whole intention, to do that. And the pilots were very well aware of that. So they dug in, and then the other side dug in, and the rest is history. So you had guys that we basically all resigned our jobs on the Thursday night. That's what the union had said we're all going to do. We're all going to put in our resignations on Thursday night. And supposedly the companies would say, wow, well, we can't have this. We'll go to the negotiating table. But the companies said, thank you very much, resignations accepted. So all of a sudden, everybody who thought this resignation ploy was just that wasn't supposed to be a ploy to get them to talk, it was suddenly a reality. So on the Friday midday, and I'll never forget that, Friday midday, we heard this, and all of us were like, what? And that was when the whole battle really, really started. And I think it was 6 weeks before they got international charter companies in. They used international flights, so something coming into Melbourne, instead of flying back to Singapore, would go Sydney first and take domestic passengers. They had the Air Force flying and all that sort of stuff. During that time, there was a lot of pressure on guys to go back to work, because you were sitting there watching everybody else doing your job. So a few people, for whatever reason they had, maybe they couldn't afford to stay out any longer or whatever it was, started breaking those picket lines and going back to work. And they, in any strike where guys break the union line, are called scabs. So that was how that term was used.
Wow.
And it was very, very hard. And it was particularly hard for me because, hard for me, it's hard for everybody, but I was just starting my 737 command training. And and that makes me go goosebumpy, because my whole fight that I had gone through, and I was now getting to this pinnacle in the career of actually becoming a captain, and whoosh, out from under my feet with the 89 pilots dispute.
Gosh, aviation is brutal. We love it, but it's brutal.
Yes, it is. It is an amazing industry, but it can be so, so cruel. And at the time, I thought I was washed up. I thought I was on the scrap heap. I went back to teaching. I was a qualified secondary school teacher as well. So that's another story, because my father said I needed to do something else besides flying. But anyway, so I went and taught maths in a girls' school. And at that time also I got married, and I thought, well, I wasn't sure when I was going to fit in having a baby, but maybe I should do it now. So I had my son at that time. And as time dragged on, I just thought, oh, gee whiz, that's the end of my career. But then these opportunities started opening up overseas, not for women, because there was still no women allowed in the Middle East or Asian carriers or anything like that. But Europe was pretty wide open, and KLM Cityhopper were expanding, and they needed pilots with airline transport licenses. And so along with several other colleagues, I applied to KLM Cityhopper. I wasn't sure how I was going to get over there or do it or anything, but I just thought I'm actually going to go and apply for this job. Went over for the interview, came back, and then 2 weeks later they said, well, yeah, you're hired, The best thing that ever happened to me. Seriously,
Wow.
the best thing ever.
So the industry in Australia compared to the industry in Europe, what do you see in terms of equal opportunities and progression into the future?
Well, when I went over there, KLM already had several, when I say several, 20 or so, I think, female pilots. But there hadn't been the struggle for them that I had had. To put it into perspective, when I got my job in Ansett, I think I was probably on a worldwide seniority list, probably about 127 on the female list. So the first women in America were a couple of years earlier. So, and then there was a couple in one in France, one in Italy. So they were starting to sort of appear in different places around the world, but more by just accepting that they were qualified and good enough to do the job rather than trying to keep them out of the job, which was what happened here. So going over there, they didn't consider me to be like, the fact that I was female was not a big issue. The fact that I was an Australian was kind of strange, like they thought that was unique, but not being female, no. So it was a lot easier.
There's so many opportunities overseas. Well, there were pre-COVID, and I guess we should probably get to the COVID point too. It's been an incredible 18 months really in the industry. What are your predictions and what do you see happening moving forward? Do you think it'll be a slow recovery, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it changes from month to month. Actually, if you look at the worldwide, I think it'll be a couple of years before we're back to anything like what we used to be pre-COVID, and that is assuming that there's nothing else happening in the meantime. That's my biggest concern. Like I saw 9/11 played havoc with the industry. SARS had its imprint on the industry. This is unprecedented. And because the recovery is taking so long, I'm just hoping that we stabilise enough and that there's nothing else disrupting it in the near future. So it's become extremely, it's always followed a sine wave, the industry, but it seems to have deviated like massive trough.
Well, we are coming towards the end of the interview. I've got a couple of quick ones for you. You mentioned your son Thomas.
Yes.
Is he flying at the moment? Have you flown together recently, or where is he?
He's flying. He's flying with Ryanair based in Edinburgh, and I went to surprise him for his birthday in February 2020, just before COVID started, and I sat on his jump seat from Edinburgh to Barcelona, and it was very funny because as a check and training captain, I fly with people who get quite nervous because they're under test and so forth. Then I was in the jump seat with Tom, and he was so nervous, and he said to me, "Mum, why do I feel like this is a check flight?" And I said, "Well, probably because it is." I'm like watching him very carefully, and he wanted to do so well for me. So, but it was brilliant. I loved every minute of it. It was fabulous.
That is so beautiful. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall on that one.
Oh, yeah. And you know what? I still haven't given up on him, and he and I flying on the same flight deck together.
Yes.
I'm not giving up on that one yet. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So that'd have to be one of your most memorable, if not the most memorable flying moment for you. Do you have anything that tops that?
Oh, I've got my top 10, what I call my top 10, yes, terrifying moments. And I think the top of the list was a flight from Amsterdam to Stavanger in a Fokker 50. and our engine anti-icing system had failed, but there was no warning to indicate that it had failed because it was a external input, total air temperature input was incorrect, and there was no measurement for that. So turning it on, it actually didn't come on, and both the engines started to perform rather poorly as they were suffocating with the ice building up, and the airplane just started sort of drifting down, if you like. And we couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, and all the indications were perfectly normal. So I think my life flashed in front of me, and was like, if I get through this, I'm going to give up flying. This has taken 10 years off my life. All these things going in front of you. And then the last thing that I remember thinking was, okay, this is not happening because I have to get back to pick up Tom from the creche. So this is not happening, right? And we got down to about 10,000 feet, and of course the ice melted and the engines recovered. So it was a very, very interesting, experience.
It sounds like the start of an air crash investigation story.
Yeah,
so this is right. The start, and this is absolutely.
That's right. Luckily, it was not. It ended up well, but yes, for a while there, I was very worried.
What's a piece of advice that you would give to a young aviation enthusiast, someone, especially in this current climate, looking at getting into aviation in some form or starting their pilot's license? What's your tips?
Well, I think I look to your story for this one because I think you've made sacrifices. I think that's what we have to do to stay in this industry, and the dedication is phenomenal. So if you want to be in it, it's the best. It is the most amazing and wonderful industry, but it requires dedication and sacrifice, and hang in there long enough and it'll be okay. For sure.
I have something that you don't know about. Yeah, surprise. So, well, I get to present you something that normally Richard would come on and do this bit, but he's left it to me. So I have a little thing to read for you. So firstly, I'd like to thank you for being here today and sharing your truly inspirational story with us. I know everyone at AeroTime and the viewers and everyone you've ever worked with would like to acknowledge your contribution to the industry, especially in promoting equality. So with that in mind, I've been asked by AeroTime's Global Executive Committee to present you with one of the very first AeroTime Aviation Achievement Awards, which is going to go on the wall. Wow. And I'm going to read you what it says. It says, in recognition of her lengthy and dedicated service to the aviation industry, for her work promoting and supporting equality, diversity, and inclusion in aviation, during which she has consistently demonstrated the best qualities, leading by example, encouraging equal opportunities for all, commitment and dedication to duty, for her support of colleagues and the next generation of aviators. The AeroTime Global Executive Committee recognises the positive influence of these efforts and the significance of the impact on the aviation industry and its people, both today and into the future.
Oh my God, Hunter, thank you so much. That's kind of, it's choked me up a bit. That is amazing. And you know what? It's given me, I think the word you used was pushing for aviation. I want to keep pushing and keep helping people because, I want to see somebody like you having a career like I had, because I know it's so special. And so thank you.
Oh, you're a beautiful human being. And when I was researching you, oh no, we are blown away with you. Seriously, I had tears when I was trying to put all, the info together and reading your story and listening to you in the car when I first heard you. You are just sensational. I'm truly honoured to get to spend some time with you. I really am.
Thanks, girl.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for joining AeroTime Hub today. You're an inspiration to me. You're an inspiration to a gazillion new pilots all across the globe. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And that brings us to the end of our AeroTime interview. Stay tuned for more women in aviation. A part of the campaign, we're going to be interviewing women across all the sectors in aviation. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hunter McLeod and you've been watching AeroTime. Goodbye.